it's always been a lifelong goal for me to make a product that is the best product out there in a category. Like I don't hesitate when it comes to finding perfection. I want to make sure that there is some perfection. Now, you may get to 98, you may not get to 100, but if you could just raise the bar even further, just a little bit further, and push a little bit harder, and work a little harder to ensure that if you're going to make that new product, it's got to be as good as the last product, because the customer will never forgive you if something isn't exactly as they want it and as they tasted it before.
What's up, everybody? Welcome to this episode of Forward to Extraordinary, a part of the Strictly From Nowhere podcast experiment. I'm your host, Justin Abrams, a serial entrepreneur in pursuit of wisdom with the goal of sharing it with all of you. You know, this is a long time coming in this episode. I would say, Mr. Chris Hobson, you probably are the one that I have chased the longest to participate with me on the show, and it is not going to let anybody down. I'm super stoked to have you here. But one of my fascinations for the Forward to Extraordinary podcast is entrepreneurs in CPG, and particularly in perishables, because, man, you got to have a heck of a stomach. That's one category and one avenue of entrepreneurship and business and thinking about the logistics of that type of industry that is not for the faint of heart. And so I find that those types of entrepreneurs are a specific breed. And so I love bringing those individuals on the show. I love hearing about their trials and tribulations and the guts to go all in. And so welcome to this episode of Forward to Extraordinary. Chris Hobson, founder of Hobbs Pickles. I cannot wait to unpack your zero to market journey.
Thank you for your persistence. I'm really excited to be here finally.
Yeah.
This is awesome.
Well, it's absolutely a pleasure. I brought a snack with me, just courteous of you and your team. So forgive me if I find my way eating into a pickle. But when I was a little kid, my dad would crack a joke on me and my sisters, mostly my sister, and he would call us pickle pusses. And so every time we went to the local bagel shop, I live here on Long Island, we're famous for our bagels, we would have to have a pickle. And so, man, I am like an OG pickle guy. I'm like the guy that goes to the farmer's market on a Saturday with his wife and kids and like has to stop at the pickle vendor. And so the reason why I want you on this show is because this is not an easy category. This is a category that's kind of saturated with competition. It's an ancient category as far as a consumable and a perishable and things that people have purchased just along the way for 150, 200, maybe even longer than that years. You have more knowledge, more story. And so I'm fascinated with the industry in itself. But enough about me and where I started in my weird childhood. This is all about you. I love starting these episodes to get to know you a little bit more. Tell me a little bit what makes you unique and a little bit about your human experience.
So I think as an entrepreneur, it really just started for me with the idea that I've got a bunch of different skill sets that I've honed. That Swiss Army knife mentality of being able to do things to the fullest, follow through on that one idea, figuring out graphic design out of school, like just the arts. A lot of that really informed some of my creativity and where that would take me with other fields that I was in. Thinking about the idea that I've got, this insatiable knowledge for things that I'm trying to learn constantly. I am running a business, but I also have this idea that I can still manage to do other things. So I make time for those other things. I've got this, this interest in I have a lot of tools in the garage. And so fixing things physically in the real world is just as important as getting on a computer and digitally trying to fix things. There's that physicality that I find is part of my tool set, whether it's repairing engines or just getting outside and splitting wood or trying to just physically be out in the world. A lot of those things have kind of added up to this having, when I need access to something, I've got it. So if I need to do a spreadsheet and master that and master the software, if I had to build the website, I'll learn WordPress and then I'll figure that all out. So that was all of these things combined with, the idea that I've had that creative background and got into graphic design, obsessing about the details, the space between letters. So it's really just this persistence to learn things and this interest to keep sort of shaping what is the next thing that I'm going to focus on.
I find it really interesting that you use the Swiss Army knife analogy. I myself am a Leatherman kind of guy, but same, just a little different. Now, I want to stick with the analogy just for a second because, a Swiss Army knife, however adaptable it is really only as good as the operator. Somebody may see, the 5, the 7, the 10, the 25 tools that come in that Swiss Army knife and are limited by the specific function of that tool and don't really think creatively about the versatility of individual tools. And so the reason why I like the comparison, the analogy of the Swiss Army knife is because some people look at a Swiss Army knife and see limitations. They see the things that the tool can't do. But I think you're of the mindset similarly to me, which is the versatility and the application is dependent on me and the collective ability of the toolkit. And so I'd love you to go a little bit deeper because it's probably the first time in 100+ episodes that somebody has used the Swiss Army analogy. It's in the back of my mind as an outdoorsman and survivalist and a prepper and all these things that I love to do in my personal time. And so I look at a tool, take a simple non-serrated straight edge blade, and I see 50 different ways that I can use that tool as a functional asset to my life. And so I'd love to know from your perspective, somebody that would claim themselves to be a Swiss Army knife. Do you find that you have categories of tools or that you have a collective consciousness of ability towards entrepreneurship?
I think it's a search for this perfection. It's this idea that you have to do something really, really well to be able to execute on it. And you have to be able to put the time in to execute on it. So it's a form of, okay, I've made it, I've made that first step forward and I know I've got this tool, but if I could work on, honing that next tool to get to that next step, what that's going to get me is a whole other, set of opportunities. And so the obsession, I think, is you have to be obsessed to be able to follow through on any of these given areas, is to just constantly dig deep, learn from other people's mistakes, research the trials and the errors that have happened before so that you have this ability to, I have a guest here. This is the dog I'm dog sitting.
She's welcome.
Yeah. Okay. Anyway, so it ended up being an opportunity to just absolutely focus on, how I can, how I can master something. Take, for example, the guitar, drums, bass. I had a home studio and I recorded music for a decade. And that for me was, how can I be as good as possible and really for myself so that I can potentially share that with others. And so it's really this idea of honing in on what it is you can do, to find that perfection in that one area, to be able to deliver on it in the best way possible. Because it's something that I can't help. It just happens. It's just this, this urge to want to learn the next thing. And that has kind of shaped the entire journey. And it's got me into some pretty interesting spots.
I resonate with this because one of the things that I pride myself on is learning enough about a problem to be able to delegate it. And I want to at least become dangerous enough on a situation to where I'm at the very least an educated consumer, educated hirer, like whatever the scenario is. While I might not be the best at X, Y, and Z, I have dabbled enough with regards to my business and what we do to know if I'm about to get myself into trouble. Now, my question for you, and it's a curiosity of mine, is there any area that you are just procrastinating on, that you're afraid of? I say this from the perspective of most people are either bullish on things like business development and sales and building your business, or very scared of it. And what I find is the folks that have more of that creative mind, that are more of the builder, that more of like the executionary, are great at taking a problem and solving it and breaking it down, neglect the sales side because it's sloggy. It's like, It's vulnerable. It feels almost like a path to nowhere. And so I'm saying this because I'm a classic salesman. It's the thing that I run towards. It's the thing that like is in my control. What do I do with my hands when I'm sitting around and not making progress in my business? I go and sell shit. So I wonder, from your perspective, is there any area that you feel that you're neglecting? Even that, as adaptable as you may be, is there a category of something that you're just like, man, I don't want to deal with that?
I wouldn't frame it as neglect, but I think there's this constant work that we need to do on ourselves where it just makes us more present and more ready for when things happen, right? And so that focus on ensuring that you're prepared for the moment always, and recentering yourself if you get off course. I think that having a really having a real targeted uh, you know approach to looking after yourself, exercise, being active, getting outside, not getting stuck in this sort of bubble, sitting in front of a screen, looking at a screen. All of that is going to make you much better for when those conversations happen, when you have an opportunity to sit down with somebody and you talk sales. I mean, sales is really, how can I be completely and utterly present and in the moment with this person and not distracted? How can I bring the best of myself to every conversation? How can I prepare myself for that conversation and have a clear mind, have some good rest behind me from the night before, and make sure that I'm going to be the best that I can be when we sit down and talk. And it's always a conversation. It's always this, it's not, this is sales, it's never framed as, there's a goal at the end of this. I don't have necessarily a goal. I think it's got to be a shared experience. And so being able to start those conversations, you have to be prepared for them. You have to be ready to say, hey, I'm willing to put in the work so I can have that conversation. I've got some meetings coming up next week, and I'll be meeting with a lot of key people and, with large retailers, across Canada. And that, being ready for that is, how can I, how can I be at the same table with people like their friends, their family, and just have a normal conversation. That's it. The goal is always just, can you get in a room with somebody and just have, just find out, who they are, how they're doing, what they're doing, make that, just get that conversation started. The sales portion of it, I just feel like, if I can surround myself with people that I love or that I like, that's all that matters.
I think it's good wisdom too. It also gives you like the cushion to fail, the cushion to try, and like at the end of the day, if that thing doesn't go wrong, go right, you fall back into some love and familiarity, and you can't fall much lower than that ground floor. And so that's really an important piece of wisdom, I think, to share for anybody that is afraid of what it takes to go and make your deal, go and make your vision come true, is take stock. Take stock of the relationships that you have and the confidence that you have, and where does your ground floor exist? Now, let me ask you a question. I'm often fascinated, and I find that this relates really nicely back to the audience in some way, shape, or form. Folks are trying to figure out, do I have what it takes? Am I an entrepreneur? I think that we all look for the validation, the credentials, somebody say, hey, you're an entrepreneur. Take me back to young Chris. What was your relationship with entrepreneurship as a young person? Was this ever your pursuit? Did you ever have a vision of owning your own business? And maybe that brings us into a little bit of like your journey along the way, because you went to work as a professional first. You've had a heck of a career. How the heck did you end up in pickles?
Well, I always answer that question by saying, for starters, I love pickles. So you have to love something to get into it to begin with.
Totally.
But the foundation of a lot of that was, growing up, I had a lot of autonomy. My parents would be like, I would just take off. I would go off into the woods. I had a dirt bike as a kid growing up, and I would just leave. In the morning, I'd wake up and I'd be gone all day. I'd come back, late at night. Sometimes there were bears out in the woods. There were things where I'd get myself into some sticky situations where, I'd be far too deep, and I'd run out of gas. There was this real sort of foundation that I was given on just being alone, being comfortable with being alone, building trust in yourself and your decisions, that foundation gave me a lot of confidence to try things, do things that maybe, if I was kind of, if I had like helicopter parents or somebody that was constantly, trying to advise on what the next step was, I may not have explored a lot of areas and a lot of things. Coming back to that sort of Swiss Army knife concept, it's it allowed me to just say, hey, I can try this, and what's the worst that can happen? Like, let's not be afraid to go forward and try some of these things. It was a lot of the arts played a role in my foundation. I mean, I went to, it was a lot of a lot of art classes in high school, commercial art. I went to art college. Parents really championed that. I'd have friends that would say, hey, can you, I've got this goalie mask, can you like airbrush this, swamp creature on the goalie mask? And I would get into that. I would, obsess about airbrushes, back in the day. And I'd started to get into the color scheme of things, and people would ask for signs, painted and built. And it was just a creative outlet for me that I would just sort of go off and do these projects for people, paid projects. But it allowed me to really kind of stretch, what I was learning, and it brought a lot to the table when it came to art. And I was also very lucky to be surrounded by some mentors that made a lot of their own mistakes. And I can't tell you how many people have shaped who I am. I'd love to believe that I was just that autonomous free spirit that went out there and just sharpened every skill that I had on my own. I was also really good at listening, and listening when it really mattered, to be able to apply some of these things, whether it was for, just life or business. Some of the decisions that I've made were, I think, whether it was just like having incredible books on the shelf that inspired me to go places, to like when I moved to San Francisco or to New York, just to give me this background on, who did it before me, who's going to inspire me and really allow me to get behind what it is that I'm getting into here. So there's just, so I think as much as I had that freedom, you have to sort of pull it back and recognize there were those key moments where somebody stepped in and suggested something.
I think there's a couple of things to unpack there. Like, first is the idea that really nobody is self-made. Everybody that is successful can at least stitch together a path of mentorship, of coaches, of enemies and adversaries. Like, all of those things make us who we are, especially as entrepreneurs. Before I tap into that one, I love kind of stitching together the make and model of what entrepreneurship looks like. And lots of folks have that question. Am I entrepreneurial? Do I have what it takes? Correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like a little bit of your story is entrepreneurship is the confidence to tackle a problem. Doesn't necessarily map to money. It typically maps to solutions and creating some value for other people, or problem solving for yourself and your immediate family. And it sounds like that maybe was a large portion of your formidable years, which was developing the confidence and the skill sets to approach problem solving in a unique way. And so I wonder if I can double down on the question, was there ever a pursuit of the financial side? It sounds like you maybe did some airbrushing as like a little bit of a side hustle. Like, was it ever about the money, or was it always just about like, man, I'm presented with a new challenge and I'm the guy?
It became apparent to me when I was in art college. One of my instructors was this famous illustrator and had this amazing mustache I'll never forget. Anyway, we sat down one day and he said to me, because I loved illustrating, I loved drawing and airbrushing and painting and just creating something real or abstract. And he said to me, you're never going to make any money in this business. You really, really have to love illustration. And it was one of those moments where I thought about, okay, well, if because I love art, if I can't really see this as an opportunity, to grow and potentially grow in a future state where I've got, a career in the arts that is going to allow me to expand and grow even further, maybe illustration isn't for me. And so having other instructors in college that said to me, got me into writing, got me into copywriting, got me into art direction, got me into commercial arts. And I started to see, well, there is a way to reshape what this is. There is a way to getting art, maybe in the commercial sense, into art. And those first key people, that whether it was this creative director who plucked me out of college in year 3 and said, look, you got to come work for this agency. It was the top agency in Canada. And he's like, he saw my portfolio, he saw the work I did, and he said, I'm not going to pay you. You're just going to come here. And I use that as an opportunity for, okay, well, he needs to pay me. So how do I do really, really killer work so that he starts to pay me? And that was the goal. So then I started to get a paycheck. And I started to come up with these ideas and work on designs, working on, like these tier 1 clients, like IKEA and Audi and just a lot of like really big brands, where he would say, hey, Chris, throw your ideas into the hat. Let me know what you think. And could you art direct this? And so I started to see this as, not only can I sit around and come up with these ideas for these great big brands, but I can execute them. I can art direct it. I can maybe have some ideas for taglines. I could build this whole career around just having other people pay me to basically build their brand. That's right out of college was an opportunity where I just said, okay, I'm not going to go the art route. I'm going to go the commercial art route. That was kind of the split that I saw. And it really got me into some places where I would be standing in front of a boardroom of people presenting an idea that was going to go national, or international, TV commercials, billboards everywhere, like really big media buys, back in the day, right? You remember advertising back in the day. And so that really gave me a foundation for, presenting an idea, thinking about what that one idea needs to be so that the collective audience of like all of these people who were either they were obsessed with the brand or just the general public, so that they would connect with it as well. And so that commercial art angle, it just gave me a launch pad basically for how I can use art and get paid well, and then just as a springboard for that next gig at another agency. I started moving around. I was in New York, San Francisco, Seattle. I moved to Vancouver, where I ended up eventually. And it was a bit of a diversion from what I thought art meant.
It's really interesting that you ended that way. I wasn't going to say this, but I come from multiple generations of art as a category, but my family's version of art is different from your explanation of it. We're like classic traditional art framed on a wall. My mom is a fine art broker dealer, and that's been my family's generational heritage. Also in like interior design, there's many different aspects of the word art. And these days, when we're thinking about digital, that's a whole different ball game. I wonder, you moved around a lot through creative agencies, and particularly in art direction, it has a very solid line to other avenues of creative agencies, things like advertising and marketing and all of the rest of the things that pull together that an ad agency would benefit from. Tell me a little bit about the path of osmosis, just being in proximity to the other skill sets. What I'm working towards is we're going to get to the inception story of Hobbs Pickles. And so all of these things that happened in your formidable career, they shape you. And, those skills, part of like that Swiss Army knife and like, the bag of skills that you carry with you, the goal is to make people a little bit more aware of the opportunities of exposure that you have around you. And while that might not have been your pursuit, which is to be like maybe a paid media specialist or something like that, your proximity to that skill set, I'm sure, rubbed off. And so tell me a little bit about what you were exposed to that was related to, maybe tangential to your specialty.
There were many opportunities to, once that idea was formulated, whether it was this little sketch that I did on a piece of paper that I had to present in front of a room of people, that eventually the photography needs to be shot. The film needs to be made. There needs to be others to bring that vision to life. And so having this skill to come up with the original concept, the original idea, then present it through this, as one person described it in advertising, the forest of nincompoops. So it's this idea that there's so many people along the way that are going to tell you it's a terrible idea. You're never going to get through this forest. So you make it out the other side, and then you have this idea, and now you have to find a director, right, who's going to shoot the commercial. Now you have to find a photographer who's going to be the right fit to shoot that campaign, to make sure that it matches your original vision. You have these clients that are in the background that are paying for it, that have to approve it, and they have to approve every step of the way. When someone might turn around and say, you know what, this like big shot CEO turns to you and goes, my daughter, I showed it to her last night. She doesn't like the color blue. I think we need to change this. And so you'd be crushed. You'd be like, I can't believe, but you would have to find a way out, right? And this is the whole thing of that Swiss Army knife mentality. You have to keep constantly finding a way to, okay, well, if I can't use that, what am I going to do to get around this obstacle? And so you end up with, you're with the crew, and you're fully set up in like Los Angeles somewhere. And you've got this this police force. We're down in this gutter, and we're shooting something for, I can't remember what camera it was that we were, company, I think it was Fuji or something. And we had all these undercover cops all dressed up down there, and the photographer shows up, and the photographer is completely wild, and I have to rein the photographer in. I have to find out, how can I communicate with this person? How can I, be adaptable enough to make sure we have a successful shoot by the end of it? And you find yourself in these situations where there's a ton of talent, and you have to rope it in, and you have to manage that talent. And then talent that turns around you in the same breath and says, some beautiful gem of a thought, and you never forget it. You're like, I will never forget that the next time I take a photograph, the next time I look at something through a lens, the next time I see how he or she managed to bring that character out of that actor. And so all of these things, they never leave you. It's like this bag of tricks that you constantly carry. And was that whole host of the people along the way that have taught me so much.
I find it really interesting. There's probably some wisdom. I'll propose the question, I guess. There's probably some wisdom in figuring out how to navigate ego, not yours, but other folks' ego, because in doing so is some incredible wisdom, and those one-liners that stick with you for an entire career. And I would love your perspective. I wasn't planning on asking any question like this, but like, what is your perspective? You seem super humble and lots of humility in what you've built along the way, but navigating ego, especially in the creatives, navigating ego is a challenge, but is often, there's a dividend in there. What is your experience with doing that?
I came up through a business that I always felt like it was filled with, people that were humble and very, very easy to work with. And then there were others, because there's so many different types, and others that, were really challenging for me to work with. I would take that as an opportunity for growth. I would say, how do I look at this person in a different light, see what it is that they're actually bringing to this conversation, bringing to this room, and how can I make it so that it's impossible for them not to want to work with me? They have to have this. We have to be on the same team. How can I get this person on the same page? There were a lot of partnerships in that business, and I was of the art director side. It was very split, and then there was a copywriter. I would get in the room, and I wouldn't always get along with the partner I was working with, or the account representative, or the president, or anybody in this company. And I would take that as, there's got to be something in common here. How can I build rapport very quickly? And how can I get us on the same page so that we can both see this through? And I love that challenge about people, because people are so complex, and knowing that you can go deep on someone's, their intuition and how they might frame it, all that deep learning and that knowledge to be able to complete the task that I've had to, get absorbed in with every project that I do. I do the same thing with people. It's like you want to study people, you want to get to know them, you want to understand them. And I think it's just it's an opportunity to, it's an opportunity to just really bring everyone and have them on the same page as you.
I'm really happy that it took so long for us to get on the show together, because in this time, so much has changed about your business. And so if I asked you the next question 6, 8 months ago, whenever we first tried to make this all happen, your answer for the next question would have been radically different. And so it's time for the origin story. I'd love to hear how we transitioned out of the career that you've been talking about into full-time entrepreneur in a category that's challenging, how you've built a business, how you're now sitting at the table with large retailers across the country. Like, a lot of this narrative wouldn't have even existed 8 months ago. It would have been like on the goals, like hopes and dreams for 2026, and now we're here. And so take me through the origin of creating the business. Where was the inception idea? Where were the guts to go all in? All the way to where we're at now. And of course, for Forward to Extraordinary, what our goals are for the future.
When I was done with the advertising business, my wife said, "Hey, look, I want to move west." And I lived out on the West Coast, loved the West Coast. So I joined her and we came out here together and we're like, what am I going to do now? Because I was kind of done with that part of my life. I was really bored. And so, she had this, really big job as like chief brand officer. And, I'm like, well, I've done all the big jobs in advertising. I don't know what I'm going to do next. And I couldn't find a good tasting pickle anywhere. And it was the weirdest thing. I'm like, why can't I not buy a good pickle, like a refrigerated pickle? Everything's like shelf stable pickles, whatever. And so that became this search when I came to Vancouver. And when I couldn't, I just thought, well, maybe I should start something. And I love Granville Island. It's this incredible, destination where they get to, I think it's 10.5 million visitors a year from all around the world. And I would shop there, and it was not far from where we lived. And so I'm walking around the market one day and I'm looking at all of these vendors and I see these open spaces and I thought, why don't I just share this concept? So this concept was something I drew this pickle tasting bar on this little pad of paper. And I love New York. When I lived in New York, it was, like Lower East Side. Like, there's something about the East that you can't get in the West, right? It's like the bagels, New York bagels are very specific, right? It's the water. Pickles, it's the water. Even Montreal has a very distinct taste. Like, their bagels are different, pickles are different. But you couldn't get that deli vibe, in Vancouver. It was just nothing here, and nothing, frankly, on the West Coast. So I met with all of these original families that were still making pickles, and the opportunity for me was, I don't know what's going to happen here. I don't know. Like, I presented the concept. Granville Island loved the idea. They thought I was going to make this in my kitchen on the stove. Right? They're like, okay, you're going to wheel a little cart in here and you'll do, sell your pickles in the market. I'm like, no. This is going to be a national brand, right? With my branding background, I knew this was going to be big. And so I wanted to do this at scale. And so I met with anyone and everyone that could. I wanted to do flavors. We're known for our flavors. So it was like, I think we brought in enough for what I thought was a month. And opening day, everyone was freaking out. The market was looking at us like we were crazy. They thought, "Oh, you're just selling cucumbers?" That's all it was just pickles. And, we have this pickle tasting bar. We wear these black ties and white shirts. That sort of Lower East Side, classic New York deli, 50s, a lot of the imagery from that, I borrowed that. I really like that era when people took pride in business ownership and serving. So that history was really part of the brand. And people were looking at us like we were crazy. We're like the Reservoir Dogs of the pickle business, right? And so we've got, these green aprons and all these pickles in these pails back here. And the whole idea is we pack it by hand. You buy it right there. And you don't technically have to buy it. We're also a tasting bar. You can just come and try it. That's totally cool. We sold out in like 2 days.
Wow.
And then we made, we doubled production. We brought a whole other, load in, and we sold out again 2 weeks later. and we had to close down because we didn't have any product to sell. So at that point, I thought, okay, this is viable. Like we've got a business here. I knew the worst thing that could happen, because you always have to play worst case scenarios out, is I'd end up with a lot of pickles. A lot of pickles that I love. So okay, I just need somewhere to put them in. Whatever, I'll walk away. But this risk of believing in it and loving loving pickles in general, and a specific type of pickle, right? I had that idea of, I remember New York, I remember the water, I remember like what it is that makes the right pickle. And that was what no one had experienced on the West Coast. Like if you have a half sour pickle, if you even mention it out here, people they look at you like you've got two heads. That's a really specific, New York delicacy, right? People are trying things for the first time. Like we had, an infant trying their very first pickle. And then the cool part is, like 5 years later, they show up at the bar and they're standing there asking for the same
That's
product.
so cool.
Or this, this 100-year-old that comes by every Thursday, with this woman who brings him, and he's like, he just kosher dills, like every week walks away with his bag. It's almost like this living, breathing focus group of getting to see people face to face, see their reactions, and get to see just how broad of a spectrum it is of who loves pickles and who has that in their blood. Because pickles are just, they're ageless, right? It's a thing that everyone knows. There are a few that stand there and they're like, I don't know, I'm not a pickle person. We tell them we have a really high conversion rate if you try like our honey mustard pickle, and they try it and they're suddenly, we get the nod, and everyone around them is astonished because they've never eaten pickles before. But it's this experiment we have, and I think it just created a groundswell, and now it's cult-like, and I get calls all the time with these customers that are like, please tell me that you're blazing sours. Please tell me you got some this weekend. I'm coming down with my wife. We're driving from way up north, and I need to have 7 quarts of them waiting for me when I get there. And if we don't have them, because we do small batches of some of our pickles, there's a lot of like, oh man, how am I going to figure this out? Like we got a woman who drives up from Portland, and she purchases for the entire office. Like she'll buy 17 bags of pickles with 2 quarts in each bag, and we have to help her out to the car with it. She takes an order for the office, at this law firm, and it's astonishing how many people we've been able to reach because of Granville Island being such a hub, a community, not only a community hub locally, but also around the world that people have visited and know. And that's kind of how it all started. And, people call me from London, England. They're flying in because their grandfather, loves the mustard ones, and he needs a jar. Can you put one aside for me? This woman at, this woman at the airport in Bangkok calls me, and she's like, we need to order 14. When I get there, we're going to be, bringing them back because she has this little group of friends where they all are familiar with these pickles now. We've touched so many people around the world. It's really quite nuts, and very humbling.
I have to tell you, I think you're a little unique in the ability, in the sense that, well, first of all, here's a cheeky question. Like, are you the only customer service representative of your business? Because you seem like first line of defense for the entire world that wants your product. Me getting these pickles here was your problem, and you have a whole team that could have handled it. And I find that very fascinating. So where does that come from? Like, why are you making all of these things your problem?
That's a great question, and it's a great question because all entrepreneurs know if they want to grow, that they can't be operators anymore. And it's a fine line of when do you step away? And do you step away? How much do you step away? Or how do you reframe what that is, that new role? And I answer the phone. I will continue to answer the phone if somebody calls. People call me and they want to talk pickles, and it's like, I'm gonna answer the call. I know who this is, and it literally says on the phone, it says who's calling, and I have pickle lover underneath, and so I know I need to pause everything and answer the phone. You're never going to get that level of connectivity with people, especially not with the founder. This is the person who fell in love with it in the first place. So I think putting yourself out there and being that person, that first line of defense, as you call it, it reminds you where you came from and what you're doing. And you can lose sight of that in growth. Having people around you that you should be able to offload some of those things to as you grow. I mean, I'm learning to do that, right? And learning to share that story and say, here's the expectation of what we need our customers to understand about what we do and what our passion is and the details as well, like why that particular pickle tastes the way it does, how you feel, what the different uses of the brine are, like how you can use it for marinating salmon, that you would put on the barbecue, like our honey mustard brine, all the different uses. Like you have to constantly educate. And I think that education piece is never ending. As somebody who's leading the business, I'm doubling down on sharing what the vision is and sharing what that voice is, how we sound, how we talk is so important because we're here to ensure that everyone's having the most amazing experience possible. And when you come to the pickle bar, it's like gourmet. Like we're 5-star and you have to feel good when somebody walks up. We're not trying to sell anything to you. We just want you to experience something. And when you get to experience all of that, you can come back and experience it again. We joke, it's like, well, you can stay here for lunch. It's like 12 p.m. Everyone's in the market looking for something to eat, and people are like, "Oh, I'm eating too many pickles." It's like, no, you can eat as much as you want. Like, this is the whole point of this is an experience. So have at it.
And I wonder if you could speak it into existence. What's the goal? How does this all play out?
My goal is to ensure that nobody has crummy pickles in the fridge. Like it's always been a lifelong goal for me to make a product that is the best product out there in a category. Like I don't hesitate when it comes to finding perfection. I want to make sure that there is some perfection. Now, you may get to 98, you may not get to 100, but if you could just raise the bar even further, just a little bit further, and push a little bit harder, and work a little harder to ensure that if you're going to make that new product, it's got to be as good as the last product because the customer, the people around you, they will never forgive you if something isn't exactly as they want it and as they tasted it before. And you just have to have that bar. It's got to be really super high, and the quality always needs to be there. The minute you diminish that, the minute you start to grow and say, oh, we're going to change our packaging, we're going to go cheaper with our ingredients, we're going to maybe we'll shift to like a shelf stable product, maybe we'll this, maybe we'll that. It shows, and you have to live up to what you've created.
As we round third base, I often like to give my guest the final thought. These conversations typically draw up some things, some ideas, some hopes and wishes, whatever it might be. And I never want my guest to leave and say, I wish I would have talked about this. I wish Justin would have asked me about that topic. So I pass it back to you, Chris. What's been on your mind for the length of the conversation?
I think that there's this theme that I keep coming back to where you have this opportunity with every new day. I love there's this this author, Ray Bradbury, who he talks about putting 2 feet on the ground in the morning and there's an explosion. Like after he gets out of bed, there's an explosion and he explodes into his day. And if we can think about exploding into every new day, and not being afraid of taking a risk or taking a chance on something and just doing something, moving it forward, even if it's a massive failure, it'll give you momentum to hone that and make it better for that next risk that you take. I think that fear of failure, it gets in the way of so many people. And I may be guilty of taking some bigger risks than other people, but I also see that as those are incredible growth opportunities that I would never have been able to tackle or carry with me now that have shaped who I am and what I've created and what I continue to create.
I've had many a conversation on the topic of failure. And after all of these discussions with folks that have experienced the many versions of the word, failure isn't a thing. I think it's a manufactured human experience word because we have a really hard time as people digesting when things don't work out. But in reality, what failure actually is a data point on the journey. And it really has nothing to do with failure, which in my brain, failure is a catastrophe. It's the end. You think heart failure, right? It's the end. For me, when we think about failure in business, it's an opportunity to grow, an opportunity to pivot, an opportunity for new partnerships, an opportunity to have learned, to have educated. And so I very much resonate with your final word of wisdom here, which is, I wonder if people are capable of changing the narrative around the complexity of the word failure. Because until you completely stop, and you can only really stop if it's lights out, it really is just data on the journey. And so now is probably a really good time for me to have a snack. Also, I'm like a kosher dill guy, but man, the horseradish is my jam. I absolutely love the horseradish pickle. So as a classic New Yorker in search of the best possible pickle, that's a good pickle.
Nice.
Chris Hobson, thank you so much for joining this episode of Forward to Extraordinary. It's been an incredible journey to unpack your story from zero to market. And I wish you forward to extraordinary.
Thanks very much. My pleasure. Glad to be here.